Hello, YouTubers. All right, now that is more or less sorted, continue with the reading. My internet, I moved pretty recently, and my internet is a lot less reliable in this new apartment. I know it's been cutting out, and some of the videos have not fully uploaded. And sorry about that. I might stop doing these as like live recordings moving forward. It really depends. So today I'm going to try to get up to page 94 just because that's the end of the actual text, and then there's a postscript after that. Pretty close to the end of this already. Maybe I'll just try to finish the whole thing. Postscript is very short, so anyway. All right, so page 68, section 4, Benjamin's concept of allegory. The development of a concept of the non-organic work of art is a central task of the theory of the avant-garde. It can be undertaken by starting from Benjamin's concept of allegory. We will see that this concept represents an especially richly articulated category, and that it can serve to illuminate certain aspects of the aesthetic effect of avant-gardist works. Benjamin developed it as he was studying the literature of the Baroque, of course, but one may say that it is only in the avant-gardist work that it finds its adequate object. Differently formulated, we may say that it was Benjamin's experience in dealing with works of the avant-garde that made possible both the development of the category and its application to the literature of the Baroque, and not the other way around. Here also, it is the unfolding of the thing in our time that makes possible the interpretation of past, earlier stages. There is thus nothing forced in the attempt to read Benjamin's concept of allegory as a theory of the avant-gardist, non-organic, work of art. That this entails the exclusion of those elements that derive from the application to the literature of the Baroque goes without saying. Yet it seems that one should ask how the emergence of a particular type of work of art, the allegorical in our present context, during periods so fundamentally different in their social structure can be explained. To turn this question into an occasion for a search after common historical and social characteristics of the two periods would surely be a mistake, for it would imply that identical art forms necessarily have an identical social base, which is certainly not the case. Instead, one will have to recognize that whereas art forms owe their birth to a specific social context, they are not tied to the context of their origin or to a social situation that is analogous to it. For the truth is that they can take on different functions in varying social contexts. The investigation should not address itself to possible analogies between primary and secondary contexts, but to the change in social function of the art form in question. As one attempts to analyze the allegory concepts into its components, the following schema results. 1. The allegorist pulls one element out of the totality of the life context, isolating it, depriving it of its function. Allegory is therefore essentially fragment, and thus the concept of the organic symbol. Quote, in the field of allegorical intuition, the image is a fragment, a rune. The false appearance of totality is extinguished. End quote. 2. The allegorist joins the isolated reality fragments and thereby creates meaning. This is posited meaning. It does not derive from the original context of the fragments. 3. Benjamin interprets the activity of the allegorist as the expression of melancholy. Quote, if the object becomes allegorical under the gaze of melancholy, if melancholy causes life to flow out of it and it remains behind dead but eternally secure, then it is exposed to the allegorist. It is unconditionally in his power. That is, it is now quite incapable of emanating any meaning or significance of its own. Such significance as it has, it acquires from the allegorist. End quote. The allegorist's traffic with things is subject to a constant alternation of involvement and surfeit. Quote, The profound fascination of the sick man with the isolated and insignificant is succeeded by that disappointed abandonment of the exhausted emblem. End quote. Benjamin also addresses the sphere of reception. Allegory, whose essence is fragment, represents history as decline. Quote, in allegory, the observer is confronted with the facies Hippocratica, the death mask of history, as a petrified primordial landscape. End quote. Leaving aside the question whether the four elements of the allegory concept quoted here can be applied to the analysis of avant-gardist works, one may note that it is a complex category, which is therefore destined to occupy an important place in the hierarchy of categories that describe works of art. For the category combines two production aesthetic concepts, one of which relates to the treatment of the material, removing elements from a context, the other to the constitution of the work, the joining of fragments and the positing of meaning, with an interpretation of the processes of production and reception, melancholy of the producer, pessimistic view of history of the recipient. Because it permits one to separate those aspects that relate to production and to aesthetic effect at the analytical level, and yet to conceive of them as a unity, Benjamin's allegory concept can function as a central category of the theory of the avant-gardist work of art. It is also true that our schematization already shows that the analytical usefulness of the category lies principally in the sphere of production aesthetics, whereas in that of aesthetic effect, supplementary elements will be needed. A comparison of the organic and non-organic avant-gardist work of art from a production aesthetic point of view finds essential support in the circumstance that the first two elements of Benjamin's concept of allegory accord with what may be understood by montage. Artists who produce an organic work, in what follows, we shall refer to them as classicists without meaning to introduce a specific concept of what the classical work may be, treat their material as something living. They respect its significance as something that has grown from concrete life situations. For avant-gardists, on the other hand, material is just that, material. Their activity initially consists in nothing other than in killing the life of the material, that is, in tearing it out of its functional context that gives it meaning. Whereas the classicist recognizes and respects in the material the carrier of a meaning, the avant-gardists see only the empty sign, to which only they can impart significance. The classicist correspondingly treats the material as a whole, whereas the avant-gardist tears it out of the life totality, isolates it, and turns it into a fragment. Just as the attitude toward the material differs, so does the constitution of the work. The classicist produces work with the intent of giving a living picture of the totality, and the classicist pursues this intention even while limiting the represented to reality segment to the rendition of an ephemeral mood. The avant-gardist, on the other hand, joins fragments with the intent of positing meaning, where the meaning may well be the message that meaning has ceased to exist. The work is no longer created as an organic whole, but put together from fragments. This will be discussed in the following section. We must distinguish between the aspects of the concept of allegory discussed up to this point, and which describe a particular procedure, and those where the attempt is made to interpret the procedure. This is the case when Benjamin characterizes the attitude of the allegorist as a melancholy. Such an interpretation cannot be transferred from the Baroque to the avant-garde without further ado, because that would limit the procedure to one meaning and thus ignore the fact that in the course of the history of its use, a procedure may perfectly well take on different meanings. In the case of the allegorical procedure, however, it seems possible to infer an attitude of the producer, which the avant-gardist shares with the Baroque allegorist. What Benjamin calls melancholy here is a fixation on the singular, which must remain unsatisfactory because no general concepts of the shaping of reality correspond to it. Devotion to the singular is hopeless because it is connected with the consciousness that reality as something to be shaped eludes one. It seems plausible to see in Benjamin's concept of melancholy the description of an attitude of the avant-gardist who, unlike the aestheticist before him, can no longer transfigure his social functionlessness. The surrealist concept of ennui, which is inadequately translated by boredom, could support such an interpretation. The second, reception aesthetic interpretation of allegory Benjamin advances, and according to which it represents history as natural history, that is, as the fated history of decline, seems to permit application to the art of the avant-garde. If one takes the attitude of the surrealist self as the prototype of avant-gardist behavior, one will note that society is here being reduced to nature. The surrealist self seeks to recover pristine experience by positing as natural the world man has created. But this means making social reality immune from any idea of possible change. It is not so much that the history man made is transformed into natural history as that it turns into a petrified image of nature. The metropolis is experienced as enigmatic nature in which the surrealist moves as primitives do in real nature, searching for a meaning that allegedly can be found in what is given. Instead of immersing himself in the secrets of man's making of this second nature, the surrealist believes he can wrest meaning from the phenomenon itself. The change in function that allegory has passed through since the Baroque is undoubtedly considerable. The Baroque depreciation of the world in favor of the beyond contrasts with what one can only call an enthusiastic affirmation of the world. But a closer analysis of the artistic methods and procedures shows this affirmation to be imperfect, the expression of a fear of a technique that has become too powerful, and of a social organization that severely restricts the individual's scope. The interpretations of the allegorical procedures sketched above cannot lay claim to the same place value as the concepts that explain the procedure itself, however, because as interpretations they already belong to that domain where the individual analysis of works is essential. In what follows, we will therefore attempt to continue confronting organic and non-organic work without as yet introducing categories of interpretation. The organic work appears as a work of nature. Quote, "Fine art must be clothed with the aspect of nature, although we recognize it to be art," end quote. Critique of Judgment. And George Lucas sees the task of the realist, as opposed to the avant-gardist, as twofold. Quote, "First, the uncovering and artistic shaping of these connections, i.e. the connections within social reality, and secondly, and inseparably from the former, the artistic covering of the connections that have been worked out abstractly, the sublation of the abstraction." End quote. What Lucas calls covering here is nothing other than the creation of the appearance of nature. The organic work of art seeks to make unrecognizable the fact that it has been made. The opposite holds true for the avant-gardist work. It proclaims itself an artificial construct, an artifact. To this extent, montage may be considered the fundamental principle of avant-gardist art. The fitted Montiat work calls attention to the fact that it is made up of reality fragments. It breaks through the appearance of totality. Paradoxically, the avant-gardist intention to destroy art as an institution is thus realized in the work of art itself. The intention to revolutionize life by returning art to its praxis turns into a revolutionizing of art. A different mode of reception that is a function of the construction principles of the various types of works corresponds to the difference suggested above. It goes without saying, this mode of reception need not in each and every case accord with the actual mode of reception of the individual work. The organic work intends the impression of wholeness. To the extent its individual elements have significance only as they relate to the whole, they always point to the work as a whole as they are perceived individually. In the avant-gardist work, on the other hand, the individual elements have a much higher degree of autonomy, and can therefore also be read and interpreted individually or in groups without its being necessary to grasp the work as a whole. In the case of the avant-gardist work, it is possible only to a limited extent to speak of the work as a whole as the perfect embodiment of the totality of possible meaning. 5. Montage. It It is important to clearly understand at the very onset that the concept of montage does not introduce a new category meant to replace the concept of allegory. Rather, it is a category that permits a more precise definition of a particular aspect of the concept of allegory. Montage presupposes the fragmentation of reality and describes the phase of the constitution of the work. Since the concept plays a role not only in the fine arts and in literature, but also in the film, it is necessary to first clarify what it refers to in each of the various media. Film is the stringing together of photographic images that, because of the speed with which they flow past the eye of the spectator, creates the impression of movement. In the film, the montage of images is the basic technical procedure. It is not a specifically artistic technique, but one that lies in the medium. Nonetheless, there are differences in its use. It is not the same thing when natural movements are photographed as when simulated ones are created by cutting. For example, the leaping stone lion in Potemkin, which is edited from shots of a sleeping, an awakening, and a rising marble lion. In the former case, there is also a montage of individual shots, but the impression created in the film only reproduces illusionistically the natural sequence of movements, whereas in the second case, it is montage that creates the impression of movement. Although montage is thus a technical device given with the medium itself, it has the status of an artistic principle in painting. It is no accident that, apart from precursors who can always be discovered after the fact, montage first emerges in connection with Cubism, that movement in modern painting which most consciously destroyed the representational system that had prevailed since the Renaissance. In the papier collé of Picasso and Braque that they created during the years before the First World War, we invariably find a contrast between two techniques. The illusionism of the reality fragments that have been glued on the canvas, a piece of a woven basket or wallpaper, and the abstraction of Cubist technique in which the portrayed objects are rendered. That this contrast is a dominant interest of the two artists can be inferred from its presence in paintings of the same period that dispense with the techniques of montage. Got one Picasso, and then that very famous Picasso. One must proceed with great care as one attempts to define the intended aesthetic effects that may be observed in the first montage canvases. There's unquestionably an element of provocation in sticking a piece of newspaper on a painting, but this must not be overestimated, for the reality fragments remain largely subordinate to the aesthetic composition, which seeks to create a balance of individual elements, volume, colors, etc. The intent can best be defined as tentative. Although there is destruction of the organic work that portrays reality, art itself is not being called into question, as it is in the historic avant-garde movements. Instead, the intent to create an aesthetic object is clear, though that object eludes judgment by traditional rules. Hartfield's photo montages represent an entirely different type. They are not primarily aesthetic objects, but images for reading. Hartfield went back to the old art of the emblem and used it politically. The emblem brings together an image and two different texts, an often coded title, inscriptio, and a lengthier explanation, subscriptio. Example, Hitler speaks, the ribcage shows an esophagus consisting of coins. Inscriptio, Adolf the Superman, subscriptio, swallows gold and spouts junk, literally tin. See illustration. Sorry about this. Or the SPD poster. Socialization marches on, and in a montage effect, some dashing gentlemen from industry with top hats and umbrellas out front and, somewhat smaller, two soldiers carrying a swastika banner. Inscriptio, Germany is not yet lost. Subscriptio, socialization marches, says on the posters of the Social Democrats, and at the same time they decide, socialists will be shot down. The clear political statement and the anti-aesthetic element characteristic of Hartfield's montages should be emphasized. In a certain sense, photomontage is close to film not only because both use photography, but also because in both cases the montage is obscured or at least made difficult to spot. This is what fundamentally distinguishes photomontage from the montage of the Cubists or Schwitters. The preceding remarks do not, of course, claim to come anywhere close to exhausting this subject, Cubist collage, Hartfield's photomontages. The aim was merely to give a sketch of all the elements the concept montage takes in. Within the frame of a theory of the avant-garde, the use to which film puts the concept cannot become relevant because it is part and parcel of the medium. And photomontage will not be made the point of departure for a consideration of the concept, for it occupies an intermediate position between montage in films and montage in painting, because in it, the fact that montage is being used is so often obscured. A theory of the avant-garde must begin with the concept of montage that is suggested by the early Cubist collages. What distinguishes them from the techniques of composition developed since the Renaissance is the insertion of reality fragments into the painting, i.e., the insertion of material that has been left unchanged by the artist. But this means the destruction of the unity of the painting as a whole, all of whose parts have been fashioned by the subjectivity of its creator. The selection of a piece of woven basket that Picasso glues on a canvas may very well serve some compositional intent. But as a piece of woven basket, it remains a reality fragment that is inserted into the painting tel quel, without substantive modification. A system of representation based on the portrayal of reality, i.e., on the principle that the artistic subject, the artist, must transpose reality, has thus been invalidated. Unlike Duchamp somewhat later, the Cubists do not content themselves with merely showing a reality fragment, but they stop short of a total shaping of the pictorial space as a continuum. If one cannot accept the explanation that reduces to a saving of superfluous effort the principle that calls into question a technique of painting that was accepted over the course of centuries, it is principally Adorno's comments on the significance of montage for modern art that furnish important clues for an understanding of the phenomenon. Adorno notes the revolutionary quality of the new procedure. For once, this overused metaphor is appropriate. Quote, the semblance of art being reconciled with a heterogeneous reality because it portrays it is to disintegrate as the work admits actual fragments of empirical reality, thus acknowledging the break and transforming it into aesthetic effect. End quote. The man-made organic work of art that pretends to be like nature projects an image of the reconciliation of man and nature. According to Adorno, it is the characteristic of the non-organic work using the principle of montage that it no longer creates the semblance of reconciliation. Even if one cannot accept in every detail the philosophy lying behind it, one will not fail to endorse this insight. The insertion of reality fragments into the work of art fundamentally transforms that work. The artist not only renounces shaping a whole, but gives the painting a different status, since parts of it no longer have the relationship to reality characteristic of the organic work of art. They are no longer signs pointing to reality, they are reality. But it is doubtful that one can follow Adorno in ascribing political significance to the artistic procedures of montage. Quote, art wishes to confess its impotence vis-a-vis the late capitalist totality and inaugurate its abolition, end quote. That montage was used both by the Italian futurists, of whom it can hardly be said that they wanted to abolish capitalism, and by Russian avant-gardists after the October Revolution, who are working in a developing socialist society, is not the only fact that militates against this formulation. It is fundamentally problematical to assign a fixed meaning to a procedure. Bloch's approach is more appropriate here, for he starts out from the view that the effects of a technique or procedure can vary in historically different contexts. He distinguishes between montage in late capitalism and montage in a socialist society. Even though the concrete determinations of Montage that block advances are occasionally imprecise, the insight that procedures are not semantically reducible to invariant meanings must be held onto. This means that one should try to pick those of Adorno's definitions that describe the phenomenon without assigning a fixed meaning to it. The following would be an example, quote, "The negation of synthesis becomes a compositional principle," end quote. On the production aesthetic side, negation of synthesis refers to what was called rejection of reconciliation on the side of aesthetic effect. If, to check Adorno's statements, one looks again at the collages of the Cubists, one can see that although they allow one to discover a principle of construction, they do not show a synthesis in the sense of a unity of meaning. One need only recall the antithesis of illusionism and abstraction to which reference was made earlier. When considering Adorno's interpretation of the negation of synthesis as a negation of meaning, one must remember that even the withholding of meaning is a positing of it. The automatic texts of the surrealists, Aragon's Paysans de Paris and Breton's Naja, all show the influence of the technique of montage. It is true that at the surface level, automatic texts are characterized by a destruction of coherence, but in an interpretation that does not confine itself to grasping logical connections but examines the procedures by which the text was composed can certainly discover a relatively consistent meaning in them. Similar considerations apply to the sequence of isolated events on the opening pages of Breton's Naja. Although it is true that they lack the kind of narrative coherence where the last incident logically presupposes all preceding ones, there is nonetheless a connection of a different kind between events. They all follow the identical structural pattern. Formulated in the concepts of structuralism, this means that the nexus is paradigmatic, not syntagmatic. Whereas the syntagmatic pattern, the phrase, is characterized by the fact that, whatever its length, the end is always reached, the sequence is, in principle, without one. This important difference also entails two differing modes of reception. The organic work of art is constructed according to the syntagmatic pattern. Individual parts and the whole form a dialectical unity. An adequate reading is described by the hermeneutic circle. The parts can be understood only through the whole only through the parts. This means that an anticipating comprehension of the whole guides and is simultaneously corrected by the comprehension of the parts. The fundamental precondition for this type of reception is the assumption of a necessary congruence between the meaning of the individual parts and the meaning of the whole. This precondition is rejected by the non-organic work, and this fact defines its decisive difference from the organic work of art. The parts emancipate themselves from a superordinate whole. There are no longer its essential elements. This means that the parts lack necessity. In an automatic text that strings images together, some could be missing, yet the text would not be significantly affected. The same is true of the events reported in Naja. New events of the same type could be added, or some of those present could be omitted, and neither addition nor omissions would make a significant difference. A change in their order is also conceivable. What is decisive are not the events in their distinctiveness, but the construction principle that underlies the sequence of events. All of this naturally has important consequences for reception. The recipient of an avant-gardist work discovers that the manner of appropriating intellectual objectifications that has been formed by the reading of organic works of art is inappropriate to the present object. The avant-gardist work neither creates a total impression that would permit an interpretation of its meaning, nor can whatever impression may be created be accounted for by recourse to the individual parts, for they are no longer subordinated to a pervasive intent. This refusal to provide meaning is experienced as a shock by the recipient, and this is the intention of the avant-gardist artist, who hopes that such withdrawal of meaning will direct the reader's attention to the fact that the conduct of one's life is questionable and that it is necessary to change it. Shock is aimed for as a stimulus to change one's conduct of life. It is the means to break through aesthetic immanence and to initiate a change in the recipient's life praxis. The problem with shock as the intended reaction of the recipient is that it is generally non-specific. Even a possible breaking through the aesthetic immanence does not ensure that the recipient's change of behavior is given a particular direction. The public's reactions to Dada manifestations are typical of the non-specificity of the reaction. It responds to the provocation of the Dadaists with blind fury. And changes in the life praxis of the public probably did not result. On the contrary, one has to ask oneself whether the provocation does not strengthen existing attitudes because it provides them with an occasion to manifest themselves. A further difficulty inheres in the aesthetics of shock, and that is the impossibility to make permanent this kind of effect. Nothing loses its effectiveness more quickly than shock. By its very nature, it is a unique experience. As a result of repetition, it changes fundamentally. There is such a thing as expected shock. The violent reactions of the public to the mere appearance of the Dadaists are an example. Newspaper reports had prepared the public for the shock. It expected it. Such a nearly institutionalized shock probably has a minimal effect on the way the recipients run their lives. The shock is consumed. What remains is the enigmatic quality of the forms, their resistance to the attempt to wrest meaning from them. If recipients will not simply give up or be contented with an arbitrary meaning extrapolated from just a part of the work, they must attempt to understand this enigmatic quality of the avant-gardist work. They then move to another level of interpretation. Instead of proceeding according to the hermeneutic circle and trying to grasp a meaning through the nexus of whole and parts, the recipient will suspend the search for meaning and direct attention to the principles of construction that determine the constitution of the work. In the process of reception, the avant-gardist work thus provokes a break, which is the analog of the incoherence, non-organicity of the work. Between the shock-like experience of the inappropriateness of the mode of reception developed through dealing with organic works of art and the effort to grasp the principles of construction, there is a break. The interpretation of meaning is renounced. One of the decisive changes in the development of art that the historical avant-garde movements brought about consists in this new type of reception that the avant-gardist work of art provokes. The recipient's attention no longer turns to a meaning of the work that might be grasped by a reading of its constituent elements, but to the principle of construction. This kind of reception is imposed on the recipient because the element necessary within the organic work, when it plays a role in constituting the meaning of the whole, merely serves to flesh out structures and pattern in the avant-gardist work. All right. By presenting the formal methods of scholarship and literature and the fine arts as the recipient's reaction to avant-gardist works that elude traditional hermeneutic approaches, we have attempted a genetic reconstruction of the nexus between the avant-gardist work and those methods. In this attempted reconstruction, the break between formal methods, which are directed at procedures and techniques, and hermeneutics that seeks to discover meaning had to be given special emphasis. But such a reconstruction of a genetic nexus must not be understood to mean that specific scholarly methods should be used in dealing with certain kinds of works, as, for example, the hermeneutic in the case of organic works, the formal in the case of avant-gardist ones. Such an allocation of methods would run counter to the thought that has been outlined here. Although it is true that the avant-gardist work imposes a new approach, that approach is not restricted to such works, nor does the hermeneutic problem of the understanding of meaning simply disappear. Rather, the decisive changes in the field of study also bring about a restructuring of the methods of scholarly investigation of the phenomenon that is art. It may be assumed that this process will move from the opposition between formal and hermeneutic methods to their synthesis, in which both would be sublated in the Hegelian sense of the term. It seems to me that this is the point that literary scholarship has reached today. The condition for the possibility of a synthesis of formal and hermeneutic procedures is the assumption that even in the avant-gardist work, the emancipation of the individual elements never reaches total detachment from the whole of the work. Even where the negation of synthesis becomes a structural principle, it must remain possible to conceive, however precious, a unity. For the act of reception, this means that even in the avant-gardist work is still to be understood hermeneutically as a total meaning, except that the unity has integrated the contradiction within itself. It is no longer the harmony of the individual parts that constitutes the whole. It is the contradictory relationship of heterogeneous elements. In the wake of the historical avant-garde movements, hermeneutics is neither to be simply replaced by formless procedures, nor is its use as an intuitive form of understanding to be continued as before. Rather, it must be modified as the new historical situation demands. It is true, however, that within a critical hermeneutics, the formal analysis of works of art takes on a greater importance as the subordination of parts to the whole, postulated by traditional hermeneutics, becomes recognizable as an interpretive system that ultimately derives from classical aesthetics. A critical hermeneutics will replace the theorem of the necessary agreement of parts and whole by investigating the contradiction between the various layers and only then infer the meaning of the whole. Chapter 5, Avant-Garde and Engagement. 1. The debate between Adorno and Lucas. In a theory of the avant-garde, a section on engagement is justified only if it can be shown that the avant-garde has radically changed the place value of political engagement in art, that the concept of engagement prior and subsequent to the avant-garde movements is not the same. It is our intent in what follows to show that this is the case. This means that the discussion of the question whether it is necessary to deal with engagement within the framework of the theory of the avant-garde cannot be separated from a discussion of the problem itself. So far, the theory of the avant-garde has been treated at two levels: the level of the attention of the historical avant-garde movements and that of the description of the avant-gardist work. The intention of the historical avant-garde movements was defined as the destruction of art as an institution set off from the praxis of life. The significance of this intention is not that art as an institution in bourgeois society was in fact destroyed, and art thereby made a direct element in the praxis of life, but that the weight that art as an institution has in determining the real social effect of individual works became recognizable. The avant-gardist work is defined as non-organic, whereas in the organic work of art, the structural principle governs the parts and joins them in a unified whole. In the avant-gardist work, the parts have a significantly larger autonomy vis-à-vis the whole. They become less important as constituent elements of a totality of meaning and simultaneously more important as relatively autonomous signs. The contrast between organic and avant-gardist work underlies both Lucas's and Adorno's theories of the avant-garde. They differ in their evaluation. Whereas Lucas holds onto the organic work of art, realistic in his terminology, as an aesthetic norm, and from that perspective rejects avant-gardist works as decadent, Adorno elevates the avant-gardist non-organic work to an, albeit merely historical, norm and condemns an aesthetic regression as aesthetic regression in all efforts to create a realistic art in Lucas's sense of the term, sense in our time. In both cases, we are dealing with a theory of art that already advances decisive definitions at the theoretical level. This does not mean, of course, that Lukács and Adorno, like the authors of Renaissance and Baroque poetics, construct general metahistorical laws by which to measure individual works. Their theories are normative only in the sense in which Hegel's aesthetics, to which both theoreticians owe a diverse debt, contain a normative element. Hegel historicizes aesthetics. The form-content dialectic realizes itself in different ways in symbolic, Oriental, classical, Greek, and Romantic Christian art. But for Hegel, this historicizing does not mean that the Romantic art form is also the most perfect. On the contrary, he considers the interpenetration of form and matter in classical Greek art a peak that is tied to a particular stage in the development of the world spirit and will necessarily pass away with it. Classical perfection, whose essence it is that, quote, the spiritual was completely drawn through its external appearance, end quote, can no longer be attained by the romantic work of art, because, quote, the elevation of the spirit to itself, end quote, is the fundamental principle of romantic art. As spirit withdraws, quote, from the external into its own intimacy with itself and posits external reality as an existence inadequate to itself, end quote, the interpenetration of the spiritual and material that classical art attained disintegrates. Hegel even goes one step further and anticipates a culmination of the Romantic in general, which he characterizes as follows, quote, the contingency of both outer and inner, and this separation of these two sides, whereby art annuls, sublates itself, end quote. With Romantic art, art comes to its end and makes way for higher forms of consciousness, i.e. philosophy. Lukács adopts essential elements of the Hegelian conception. Hegel's confrontation of classical and romantic returns in his work as the opposition between realistic and avant-gardist art. And like Hegel, Lukács also develops this opposition within the framework of a philosophy of history. In Lukács, of course, that philosophy is no longer the movement of the world spirit, who withdraws to itself from the external world and thus destroys the possibility of a classical harmony between intellect and sensuousness. It is materialistic, the history of bourgeois society. With the end of the bourgeois emancipation movement, the 1848 June Revolution, the bourgeois intellectual also loses the ability to portray bourgeois society as a changing society in the totality of a realistic work of art. In the naturalistic absorption in detail and the associated loss of an encompassing perspective, we have the intimation of the dissolution of bourgeois realism, which reaches its climax in the avant-garde. This development is the development of a historically necessary decline. Lukács thus transfers Hegel's critique of Romantic art as historically necessary symptom of decay to the art of the avant-garde. On the other hand, he largely adopts Hegel's view that the organic work of art constitutes a type of absolute perfection, except that he sees the realization of this type in the great realistic novels of Goethe, Balzac, and Stendhal, rather than in Greek art. This suggests that for Lukács also, the culmination of art lies in the past, though it is true that he differs from Hegel in not feeling that perfection is necessarily unattainable in the present. Not only did the great realistic writers of the ascent of the bourgeoisie become models of socialist realism, according to Lukács, but he goes further and tries to accentuate the radical consequences of his historical philosophical construct, the impossibility of a bourgeois realism after 1848 or 1871, by also allowing for a bourgeois realism in the 20th century. Adorno is more radical on this point. For him, the avant-gardist work is the only possible authentic expression of the contemporary state of the world. Adorno's theory is also based on Hegel, but does not adopt its evaluations. negative view of Romantic art versus high estimation of classical art, which Lucas transferred to the present, Adorno attempts to think radically and to take to its conclusion the historicizing of the art forms that Hegel had undertaken. This means that no historical type of the form-content dialectic will be given a higher rank than any other. In this perspective, the avant-gardist work of art presents itself as the historically necessary expression of alienation in late capitalist society. To propose measuring it against the organic coherence of the classical or realistic work would be improper. It seems at first as if Adorno had definitively broken with any normative theory, but it is not difficult to see how, by way of a radical historicizing, the normative again enters into theory and stamps it no less markedly than in Lucas's case. So I just noticed that my computer says that it's plugged in, but is not charging, it's discharging. Kind of a bad sign. It's not changing at all. Well, I guess it's a race against time. I'm at 17% here. It doesn't give me much time. For Lukács also, the avant-garde is the expression of alienation in late capitalist society. But for the socialists, it is also the expression of the blindness of bourgeois intellectuals vis-à-vis the real historical counterforces working toward a socialist transformation of this society. It is on this political perspective that Lukács bases the possibility of a realistic art in the present. Adorno does not have this political perspective. Therefore, avant-garde art becomes for him the only authentic art in late capitalist society. Every attempt to create organic, coherent works, which Lukács calls realist, is not merely a regression beyond an already attained level of artistic techniques, it is ideologically suspect. Instead of bearing the contradictions of society in our time, the organic work promotes, by its very form, the illusion of a world that is whole, even though the explicit contents may show a wholly different intent. This is not the place to decide which of the two approaches is correct. Rather, the intention of the theory sketched here is to demonstrate that the debate itself is historical. To do so, it must be shown that the premises of the two authors are already historical today, and that it is therefore impossible to simply adopt them. One may formulate the following thesis. The dispute between Lukács and Adorno concerning the legitimacy of avant-gardist art as outlined above is confined to the sphere of artistic means and the change in the kind of work this involves, organic versus avant-gardist. Yet the two authors do not thematize the attack that the historical avant-garde movements launched against art as an institution. According to the theory here set forth, it is this attack, however, that is the decisive event in the development of art in bourgeois society. Because that attack first made recognizable the institution that is art, as it made recognizable that institution's determining influence on the effect individual works will have. Where the significance of the break in the development of art as caused by the historical avant-garde movements is not seen in the attack on art as an institution, the formal problem, organic versus non-organic work, necessarily comes to occupy the center of reflection. But once the historical avant-garde movements revealed art as an institution as the solution to the mystery of the effectiveness of or ineffectiveness of art, no form could no longer claim that it alone had either eternal or temporally limited validity. The historical avant-garde movements liquidated such a claim. Because Lukács and Adorno make it once more, they show that their thought is still dominated by a pre-avant-gardist period that knew historically conditioned stylistic change. It is certainly true that Adorno brought out the significance of the avant-garde for aesthetic theory in our time, but in so doing, he insisted exclusively on the new type of work, not on the intent of the avant-garde movements to reintegrate art in the praxis of life. In that way, the avant-garde becomes the only type of art that is appropriate to our time. This view is true in the sense that today, the farther-reaching intentions of the avant-garde movements can in fact be judged to have failed. Its untruth lies in the fact that it is precisely this failure that had certain consequences. The historical avant-garde movements were unable to destroy art as an institution, but they did destroy the possibility that a given school can present itself with a claim to universal validity. That realistic and avant-gardist art exist side by side today is a fact that can no longer be objected to legitimately. The meaning of the break in the history of art that the historical avant-garde movements provoked does not consist in the destruction of art as an institution, but in the destruction of the possibility of positing aesthetic norms as valid ones. This has consequences for scholarly dealings with works of art. The normative examination is replaced by a functional analysis, the object of whose investigation would be the social effect function of a work, which is the result of the coming together of stimuli inside the work and a sociologically definable public within an already existing institutional frame. Lucas's and Adorno's failure to deal with art as an institution will have to be seen in connection with something else the two theoreticians share, and that is their critical attitude toward the work of Brecht. In Lucas's case, the rejection of Brecht is a direct result of his theoretical approach. Brecht's work falls under the same verdict as all non-organic work. In Adorno's case, the rejection is not a direct outflow of a central theoretical position, but of a subsidiary theorem, according to which works of art are the, quote, unconscious historiography of what is norm and what is monstrous in history, end quote. Where the nexus between the work and the society that conditions it is posited as necessarily unconscious, Brecht, who endeavored to give shape to this nexus with the highest possible degree of consciousness, can hardly be adequately received. To summarize, the Lucas-Adorno debate, which in many respects resumes the expressionism debate of the mid-30s, ends with an aporia, two theories of culture that undertake themselves as materialists confront each other antagonistically, and both are tied to specific political positions. Adorno not only sees late capitalism as definitively stabilized, but also feels that historical experience has shown the hopes placed in socialism to be ill-founded. For him, avant-gardist art is a radical protest that rejects all false reconciliation with what exists, and thus the only art form that has historical legitimacy. Lucas, on the other hand, acknowledges its character as protest but condemns avant-gardist art because that protest remains abstract, without historical perspective, blind to the real counterforces that are seeking to overcome capitalism. A common element in both approaches, in which the aporia is not abolished but intensified, is that for reasons relevant to their theories, both authors are incapable of understanding the most important materialist writer of our time, Brecht. In this situation, a way out seems to offer itself, and that would be to make the theory of this materialist writer the yardstick of judgment. But this solution has a considerable drawback. It does not permit an understanding of Brecht's work, for Brecht cannot become the horizon of judgment and simultaneously be understood in his distinctiveness. If one makes Brecht the yardstick for what literature can accomplish today, Brecht himself can no longer be judged, and the question whether the solution he found for certain problems is tied to the period of its creation or not can no longer be asked. In other words, it is precisely when one attempts to grasp Brecht's epochal significance that his theory must not be made the framework of the investigation. To resolve this aporia, I would propose that the historical avant-garde movements be seen as a break in the development of art in bourgeois society, and that literary theory be conceived on the basis of this break. Brecht's work and theory also would have to be defined with reference to this historical discontinuity. The question then would be, what is Brecht's relationship to the historical avant-garde movements? So far, this question has not been asked because Brecht was taken for an avant-gardist and a precise concept of historical avant-garde movements did not exist. This complex question cannot be examined here, of course, and we will have to content ourselves with a few suggestions. Brecht never shared the intention of the representatives of the historical avant-garde movements to destroy art as an institution. Even the young Brecht, who despised the theater, the educated bourgeoisie, did not conclude that the theater should be abolished altogether. Instead, he proposed to radically change it. In sport, he found the model for a new theater whose central category is fun. Not only does the young Brecht define art as its own end and thus retain a central category of classical aesthetics, he intends to change rather than destroy the theater as an institution, and thus makes clear the distance that separates him from the representatives of the historical avant-garde movements. What they and Brecht share is, first, a conception of the work in which the individual elements attain autonomy, this being the condition that must be met if alienation is to become effective. And second, the attention he devotes to art as an institution. But whereas the avant-gardists believe they can directly attack and destroy that institution, Brecht develops a concept that entails a change of function and sticks to what is concretely achievable. These few comments may have shown that a theory of the avant-garde permits one to situate Brecht within the context of modern art and thereby to define his distinctiveness. There is thus reason to assume that a theory of the avant-garde can contribute to a resolution of the aporia of materialist literary scholarship between Lucas and Adorno, as sketched above, and that this can be done without canonizing Brecht's theory in artistic practice. It goes without saying that the thesis being advanced here refers not only to Brecht's work, but to the place of political engagement in art generally. It is this: through the historical avant-garde movements, the place of political engagement in art was fundamentally changed. In consonance with the twofold definition of the avant-garde as given above, attack on art as institution and the coming into existence of a non-organic work of art, the question will have to be discussed at both levels. That there existed political and moral engagement in the art preceding the historical avant-garde movements is beyond doubt. But the relationship between this engagement and the work in which it articulated itself is strained. In the organic work of art, the political and moral contents the author wishes to express are necessarily subordinated to the organicity of the whole. This means that whether the author wants to or not, they become parts of the whole, to whose constitution they contribute. The engaged work can be successful only if the engagement itself is the unifying principle that articulates itself throughout the work, and this includes its form. But this is rarely the case. The degree to which already existing traditions in a genre can resist being used for purposes of moral or political engagement can be observed in Voltaire's tragedies and the freedom lyric of the Restoration. In the organic work of art, the danger is always present that engagement remains external to the form-content totality and destroys its substance. It is at this level of argument that most criticism of engaged art moves. The two presuppositions must be met if this argument is to claim validity. It applies only to organic works of art, and only when engagement has not been made the unifying principle of the work. Where the author is successful in organizing the work around the engagement, another danger threatens the political tendency: neutralization through the institution that is art. Received in the context of artifacts whose shared characteristic is their apartness from the praxis of life, the work that shapes engagement according to the aesthetic law of organicity tends to be perceived as a mere art product. Art as an institution neutralizes the political content of the individual work. The historical avant-garde movements made clear the significance art as an institution has for the effect of individual works, and thereby brought about a shift in the problem. It became apparent that the social effect of a work of art cannot simply be gauged by considering the work itself, but that its effect is decisively determined by the institution within which the work functions. Had there never been any avant-garde movements, Brecht's and Benjamin's reflections from the 20s and 30s regarding a restructuring of the production apparatus would not have been possible. Here also, however, one will have to take care not to adopt Brecht's and Benjamin's solutions along with their recognition of the problem and to transfer them ahistorically to the present. For the shift in the problem of engagement, the development of a type of non-organic work is as important as the attack on art as an institution. If, in the avant-gardist work, the individual element is no longer necessarily subordinate to an organizing principle, the question concerning the place value of the political contents of the work also changes. In the avant-gardist work, they are aesthetically legitimate even as individual elements. Their effect is not necessarily mediated through the whole of the work, but to be thought of as standing on its own. In the avant-gardist work, the individual sign does not refer primarily to the work as a whole, but to reality. The recipient is free, but responds to the individual sign as an important statement concerning the praxis of life, or as political instruction. This has momentous consequences for the place of engagement within the work. Where the work is no longer conceived as organic totality, the individual political motif also is no longer subordinate to the work as a whole, but can be effective in isolation. On the basis of the avant-gardist type of work, a new type of engaged art becomes possible. One might even go a step further and say that the avant-gardist work does away with the old dichotomy between pure and political art, although it will have to be made clear what the sentence means. Following Adorno, it may mean that the structural principle of the non-organic is emancipatory in itself, because it permits the breakup of an ideology that is increasingly congealing into a system. In such a view, avant-garde and engagement ultimately coincide. But since the identity rests wholly in the structural principle, it follows that engaged art is defined only formally, not in its substance. The tabooing of political art in the avant-gardist work is just one step away from this. But the abolition of the dichotomy between pure and political art can take a different form. Instead of declaring the avant-gardist structural principle of the non-organic itself to be a political statement, it should be remembered that it enables political and non-political motifs to exist side by side in a single work. On the basis of the non-organic work, a new type of engaged art thus becomes possible. To the extent that individual motifs in the avant-gardist work are largely autonomous, the political motif also can have a direct effect. The spectator can confront it with life as he experiences it. Brecht recognized and made use of the possibility. In his Arbeitsjournal, he writes, quote, "In the Aristotelian composition of plays and the acting that goes along with it, the delusion of the spectator concerning the way events on the stage take place in real life and come about there is furthered by the fact that the presentation of the fable constitutes an absolute whole. The details cannot be individually compared with those parts which correspond to them in real life. Nothing must be taken out of context to set it into the context of reality. This is changed by performance that produces estrangement. Here, the progress of the fable is discontinuous. The unified whole consists of independent parts, each of which can and indeed must be directly confronted with the corresponding partial events in reality." End quote. Brecht is avant-gardist to the extent that the avant-garde work of art makes possible a new kind of political art because it frees the parts from their subordination to the whole. Brecht's comments make clear that although the avant-garde work of art necessarily falls short of attaining the goal of the historical avant-garde movements, which is the revolutionizing of the praxis of life, it yet preserves their intent. Although the total return of art to the praxis of life may have failed, the work of art entered into a new relationship to reality. Not only does reality in its concrete variety penetrate the work of art, but the work no longer seals itself off from it. It must be remembered, however, that it is art as an institution that determines the measure of political effect avant-garde works can have, and that art in bourgeois society continues to be a realm that is distinct from the praxis of life. I'm going to try to fix my computer. I'll be back in a minute. Hopefully, my computer is not totally dead.